If you like what I do, consider joining my channel or donating to my coffee. Links in the description.
You heard about Sean, right?
No, what happened to Sean?
Well, you know he was selling acid. Right.
What is this? Oh, I'm king of the trees. I'm the tree meister. I count on them. Drinking out of cups.
Chemicals, man. They'll f*** you up.
Ultros was a trip, and I'm not just talking about its flamboyant and eye-melting visuals. When I first started playing, I hated it. I hated its art style, I hated its time loop mechanic. There just wasn't a lot that I initially liked about this game. I dreaded the thought of booting it up and found myself making excuses to avoid playing it. But I wanted to give the game a fair shake, so I persevered. And over time, as I delved deeper into the sarcophagus and its inner machinations, my dread slowly transformed into genuine curiosity. Then, by about mid-game, so like 4 or 5 hours in, that curiosity blossomed into full-blown intrigue. I had begun appreciating what the game was doing and found myself hooked by its cryptic narrative and gameplay loop. Before I knew it, I had finished the game with the violent or bad ending. Craving more, I then went on to try to get its true ending, which I'll discuss later. For now, I want to take a step back and introduce the game properly. In Ultros, you play as Ouija, who, by the way, is never named in-game. At least, I don't recall anyone calling her by name. I found her name through a weird shoe collab the game did. Anyway, Ouija is a space traveler who awakens to find herself trapped in a time loop on an unfamiliar spacecraft. To free herself from this loop, she must hunt down and kill the ship's shamans, which is pretty easy considering they're in deep meditation stuck inside pods. But will killing these shamans have untold consequences? There's only one way to find out. It's an intriguing premise, but like I said earlier, the game took a while to actually hook me, but are an intriguing premise and a unique visual style enough to make a great Metroidvania.
Combat.
Combat in Ultros is easy to understand, but tougher to master, at least if you're aiming to optimize it. At its core, the system feels intuitive and satisfying. If you keep pressing the attack button while on the ground, Ouija performs a quick 3 to 4 hit combo. Jump into the air, and she'll unleash a spinning attack that makes her look like Sonic the Hedgehog mid-spin dash. It's flashy, simple, and feels great to pull off. Where things get tricky and interesting is with what I'm calling the perfect variety system. I don't know if that's the actual name, but whatever. Here's how it goes. When you defeat enemies, they drop food, but the quality of that food depends on the variety of moves you use to take them down. If you just spam the same ground combo over and over, you'll get low quality food. If you mix things up, air attacks, combos, dodges with counterattacks, you're rewarded with higher quality food. Why does this matter? Well, the quality of food determines the nutrients it provides, and nutrients play a big role in Ultros. But I'll get into that deeper in the progression section. For now, just know that the game actively encourages you to switch up your combat approach, which adds a fun layer of risk and creativity to what is otherwise a straightforward system. Beyond the perfect variety system, combat remains pretty simple. Enemies aren't particularly threatening, in fact, some are outright docile, and Ouija has a dodge that's more than enough to keep her safe. If you time your dodge just as an enemy attacks, you can follow up with a devastating counterattack. It's satisfying and gives the combat a little bit more of a risk-reward element, though you won't find yourself sweating to master it. And even if you suck at it, Ouija can devour food in real time to replenish your health. When it comes to bosses, Ultros stays on brand. Bosses aren't much more threatening than regular enemies, and now that I think about it, I didn't die once during my playthrough. That's not to say boss encounters are bad, but if you're looking for a challenge, this isn't where you'll find it. At least, not in the traditional combat sense, but we'll get into all that later. As for the boss designs, well, they all looked like an acid trip exploded and then took some sort of nebulous form. If you love chaotic, colorful, otherworldly visuals, you'll probably love these bosses and the game's other NPCs. And that's combat in Ultros. Intuitive and easygoing with a creative system that rewards variety over butt mashing. It's not the most challenging experience, but mixing up your attacks to get better food adds a fun twist to an otherwise simple system.
Abilities. Platforming.
In Ultros, Ouija's toolkit is both expansive and refreshingly unique. Unlike traditional Metroidvanias that revolve around unlocking new traversal maneuvers, Ultros focuses on using tools to manipulate the environment itself so you can traverse it. It's a stark deviation from the typical Metroidvania framework, but it works brilliantly and gives Ultros its distinct identity. Let's start with the traditional abilities. Ouija gains a double jump early on that's 100% necessary to progress. She also gets a wall jump, which honestly, you could do without. It's there, but it's not the game changer you might expect from similar games. Now, onto where Ultros truly sets itself apart. Ouija's unique abilities, which tie into two key mechanics, the extractor and gardening. First, let's talk about gardening. Hold on to your butts! This gets a little complicated, but in a good way. As you explore the sarcophagus, you'll find all kinds of seeds and designated gardens where you can plant them. Each seed grows into a plant with unique properties that aid in traversal. For example, one seed grows into a tall tree that you can use as a platform to reach higher locations, while another sprouts vines you can swing from to access far-off areas. There are about a dozen different seeds to experiment with, each with their own utility. Part of the fun and challenge of Ultros is figuring out which seed works best in which situation. But here's where things get more interesting: the game's time loop mechanic. Though you restart each loop with nothing but your knowledge, the plants you've sowed persist and continue to grow. When you revisit a garden in a later loop, the plants you planted earlier will have expanded, offering you new opportunities to traverse areas you couldn't access before. And there are some advanced mechanics you can use to navigate this world. Need a plant to reach somewhere, but there's no garden to plant it? Feed an enemy food. During the next loop, the enemy will have made the ground fertile, giving you a brand new garden to plant in. Don't feel like waiting for an entire time loop to pass? That's where compost comes in. This brings us to Ouija's extractor, a little floating tool that allows her to interact with the world in unique ways. One of the extractor's abilities is digging. Ouija launches the extractor into the soil, and it either uncovers compost, which empowers your plants to grow bigger and stronger immediately, or pops out a seed so you can replant something more suitable for the situation. It's an incredibly useful ability and something you'll rely on constantly as you progress. The extractor has a bunch of other functions that further expand your gardening options and help manipulate your plants in creative ways, but I won't spoil everything here. Discovering all the clever things you can do is half the fun. As for Ultros' platforming, it's a far cry from what most Metroidvania veterans are used to. Platforming isn't difficult, and you won't find yourself sweating over tricky sections that demand twitch reflexes or precision jumps. Instead, Ultros is all about planning and foresight. The game challenges you to think ahead, plant the proper plants, and use your environment creatively to overcome obstacles. Sometimes in the current loop, and sometimes in a later one. It's a slower, more deliberate approach to platforming that feels deeply satisfying when your careful planning pays off. And that's it for abilities and platforming. Ultros takes a bold, unique approach by swapping out traditional traversal upgrades for an innovative system of gardening and environmental manipulation. It's less about how you move and more about how you shape the world around you. And the game's time loop mechanic ensures every decision feels meaningful. The result is a platforming experience that's engaging in an entirely different way, exercising your brain as much as your reflexes.
Progression.
Progression in Ultros is yet another area where the game boldly deviates from traditional Metroidvania norms. So much so that it's hard to pin down exactly how to classify it. It's not a full-fledged Metroidvania because there are no RPG elements like leveling up or stat customization, and it's tough to call it a straightforward Metroid-like since exploration doesn't reward you with direct enhancements like HP upgrades. Instead, Ultros introduces a system centered around nutrition and the cortex. Let's start with the cortex. In Ultros, the cortex is both a part of the brain and a skill tree. But the skill tree doesn't use skill points. Instead, unlocking abilities requires specific nutrients, which is where the game's combat and food systems come into play. As I mentioned in the combat section, defeating enemies drops food, and the quality of that food depends on the variety of moves you use to take enemies down. Spamming a single combo will net you low quality food, while mixing up your moves earns you higher quality food. Higher quality food provides more nutrients, and these nutrients are what you'll need to unlock skills in the cortex. Nutrition also plays a factor in some of the skills you unlock, such as the self-regenerating skill that's based on how high one of your nutrition stats is. The higher the stat, the faster the healing. Unfortunately, as cool as the cortex system is early on, it loses some of its appeal in the late game. By this point, the abundance of fruit produced by your plants makes gathering food from enemies feel unnecessary, which, if I had to make a guess, is part of the game's theming, but that's something we'll get into much later. Basically what I'm saying, because you're planting so much, you'll have more than enough nutrition on hand, which reduces the need to carefully plan out your combat strategies for high quality food drops, at least in the mid to late game. Moreover, this system gets further diminished once you gain the option to lock abilities with special items. Normally, when you enter a new loop, skills reset and must be unlocked again. However, by finding these special items, you can permanently lock certain skills so they carry over to future loops. The more skills you lock, the less reliant you become on nutrition and the cortex system, which marginalizes the need for food drops from combat. And that's it for progression. Ultros takes a unique approach by intertwining combat, nutrition, and skill development in its cortex system. While it's a fresh and intriguing mechanic early on, the late game's abundance of fruit and locked skills gradually undermine its importance. Despite this, the system remains a standout feature for its creativity and how it ties combat variety directly to character progression. It's not a perfect system, but it's undeniably distinct, much like the rest of Ultros.
Exploration.
Exploration in Ultros is yet another area where the game subverts traditional Metroidvania expectations. While you'll spend plenty of time exploring the sarcophagus, the rewards you reap are less about direct enhancements for Ouija and more about thoughtfully manipulating the environment to gain access to new areas, either immediately or in future cycles. Let me explain. One of Ultros' most fascinating mechanics is its use of gardening to reshape the world. As discussed earlier, plants serve practical purposes, such as creating platforms, vines, or pouring liquids onto mechanisms to unlock paths. Some plants yield instant gratification, like a tree growing just tall enough for you to leapfrog onto a higher platform. Others provide delayed benefits, where the full extent of their usefulness only becomes clear in a future loop as they grow larger and stronger over time. If you're impatient though, you can use compost to accelerate a plant's growth and reap its benefits immediately. This combination of instant and delayed gratification strikes a delicate balance, keeping exploration engaging without making it feel like a slog of meticulous planning. Constantly having to wait for plants to grow would feel exhausting, but Ultros avoids that trap for the most part. Now, I'll be honest, if you're a traditional Metroidvania enjoyer expecting hidden upgrades to directly enhance your character, Ultros might disappoint. Exploration here isn't about finding more health, stronger weapons, or cool new traversal abilities. The main tangible items you'll discover are special items that lock your cortex skills, so they're not erased in future loops, and a map upgrade that reveals compost locations. Scouring every inch of the sarcophagus for rewards doesn't feel as satisfying as it does in other MVs because Ouija's growth is tied to her nutrition in the cortex system, not exploration. But again, that doesn't mean exploration isn't rewarding. Ultros just redefines what rewarding exploration looks like. Instead of traditional power-ups, you'll find seeds that add depth to the gardening system. Experimenting with seeds and learning how to use each plant effectively becomes its own game, but more on that in the spoiler section. However you slice it, manipulating plants to help traverse this world offers a sense of satisfaction unique to Ultros. The biomes in Ultros are okay. The game's vibrant, kaleidoscopic color scheme can sometimes make areas blur into each other, especially early on. That said, there are standout sections later in the game that shake things up. One biome introduces a teleporting mechanic involving a smackable eyeball, which adds a fun, puzzly twist to traversal. Another biome goes completely off the rails and turns into a game show filled with bizarre minigames. Because why not? The in-game map is fine. It accurately displays the shape of rooms, and there are cortex skills that unlock additional map details. However, you can't mark up the map, which feels like a missed opportunity for a game this dense. Alright, let's talk about fast travel because it's a bit of a letdown. Yes, the game eventually gives you a fast travel system, but it's not particularly helpful or intuitive. Getting the system up and running takes a lot of effort, and even when it's functional, it doesn't make backtracking as convenient as it should. I'll dive deeper into this in the spoiler section, but just know that fast travel, though unique and thematically interesting, isn't Ultros' strong suit. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the time loop mechanic and how it resets your progress. I'll be honest, this initially scared me off the game because I'm not a fan of roguelike elements creeping into my Metroidvanias. Every time you complete a cycle, let's say after a boss fight for spoiler's sake, you get sent back to the beginning of the game. You lose your sword, your cortex skills that aren't locked, and your extractor, which has a lot of your traversal abilities or secondary skills. That all sounds terrible. It sounds demoralizing. It sounds like the exact opposite of what makes Metroidvania satisfying. But here's the twist. It's not as bad as it sounds. The developers designed the loops brilliantly to ensure they never feel tedious or punishing. For one, the plants you've grown stay in the world, continuing to grow between cycles and providing greater benefits on your next run. Additionally, any map progress you made persists, so you don't lose your sense of direction or where you have and haven't been. Reclaiming your core tools like the sword and extractor becomes faster with each loop, thanks to an NPC named Gardener. This dude is a real one. Most importantly, the special items that lock cortex skills make each new loop more manageable. As you lock in key skills, you retain progress between cycles, making subsequent runs feel smoother and less repetitive. Ultimately, Ultros turns what sounds like a frustrating mechanic into something surprisingly satisfying. The loops don't feel like a punishment, they feel like a carefully designed progression system. And credit to the developers for ensuring you always know where to go next after starting a new loop, so you never feel lost or aimless. That's it for exploration. Exploration in Ultros may not scratch the traditional Metroidvania itch, but it offers its own brand of satisfaction through its unique gardening mechanics and time loop system. While you won't find the typical power-ups or stat boosts, experimenting with seeds, growing plants, and reshaping the environment is an engaging and rewarding process in and of itself. The game's colorful biomes and creative variety keep things fresh, and while fast travel falls short, the well-designed guidance from the developers after each time loop ensures you're always making meaningful progress.
Atmosphere. Narrative.
One look at Ultros and you'll know exactly what kind of experience you're in for. Its psychedelic visuals, alien environments, and otherworldly character and enemy designs combine to create a game that feels like nothing else out there. It's as if an acid trip collided with an extraterrestrial fever dream, immersing players in a world that is completely foreign and bizarre. I'll admit, I'm a bit torn when it comes to the visuals. On one hand, the developers absolutely nailed their goal of creating a truly alien atmosphere. And on the other hand, I personally found the visuals way too distracting. The constant swirl of colors, the overwhelming vibrancy, it was a bit much for me, but hey, that's just me. If you're someone who enjoys games that overwhelm your senses with a kaleidoscope of otherworldly imagery, Ultros is here for you. Plus, there are some accessibility options where you can actually tone down some of the visuals, so take a look at that as well. As for the music, I honestly don't have much to say. Between the distracting visuals and the engrossing gardening mechanics, I can't remember a single track. I guess I'm just the worst reviewer on the planet. But in all seriousness, it's not that the music is bad, it's just that it faded into the background for me. That might be a compliment in its own way, as it means the soundtrack blends seamlessly into the experience without detracting from the gameplay. Now, let's talk about the narrative. I absolutely loved it. The story is cleverly delivered, keeping players in the dark as they piece together what's happening in this strange world. That said, the beginning of the game does suffer from an overuse of unfamiliar proper nouns. It felt like the developers were a bit too eager to showcase their world building, hitting you over the head with, "Look at all this lore we've created." Subtlety would have gone a long way here, but fortunately, the game quickly finds its footing. As the story unfolds, the world becomes deeply engaging, and you'll find yourself fully invested in its mysteries. One interesting aspect of the narrative is how the time loop mechanic affects NPC interactions. Unlike Ouija, NPCs do not retain their memories from cycle to cycle, so their dialogue doesn't change much between loops, except for Gardner for some reason. Perhaps because he's so attuned to nature, the one constant in the sarcophagus between loops? Anyway, the game keeps things fresh by occasionally throwing unexpected events your way. Just when you think you've settled into the gameplay loop, something comes along to shake things up, staving off any monotony that might set in from repeating cycles. And then there's that moment. I don't want to get into specifics just yet, but about halfway through the game, something happens that changes everything. The way you view the game, the way you play it, and even how you experience the world itself. It's a drastic shift in the game's formula that ties perfectly into its narrative themes. And the best part? It's entirely optional. This incredible revelation breathes new life into the game, literally, and stands as one of the game's most memorable moments. And, naturally, engaging with this mechanic is how you achieve the game's true ending. And this is your spoiler warning. If you don't want to hear more about this mechanic or the plot specifics, skip to this timestamp to fast travel to my final thoughts.
Spoilers.
First off, let's talk about Ouija herself. The game implies, though never outright confirms, that Ouija is one of the 8 shamans, those tasked with containing Ultros. Consider the room with 8 locks, the fact that you only have to break 7 shamans' capsules, and how the area where Ouija awakens each cycle looks suspiciously like it has one of those capsules in the background. It's pretty clear that Ouija isn't just a wandering sojourner, but part of the shamazel. This adds a fascinating layer to the narrative. The spirit of the dead hunter who guides Ouija early on is likely the one who freed her, sacrificing himself to give her a chance to stop the time loops and, ultimately, Ultros. When the spirit stops appearing after a few loops, it's likely because he's found peace, finally realizing Ouija is continuing his work and fulfilling his purpose. If this is the case, and it certainly feels like it, the storytelling here is subtle and deeply rewarding for players who like piecing things together themselves. Now, let's talk about that game-changing mechanic I alluded to earlier, the living network. This mechanic completely redefines how you interact with the world. Essentially, Ouija gains a rainbow tether that can connect her to nodes in the environment. starting with those mechanical lady consoles you see throughout the sarcophagus. Connecting the tether to these consoles allows them to perform functions like opening doors or activating platforms. Soon, you realize the tether can connect to plants. And then, the kicker, you can connect it to plants you've planted. This revelation expands possibilities dramatically. The living network isn't just a neat tool that unlocks doors. It's a system with the potential to span the entire sarcophagus. And with that revelation, you think, what if I could connect every shaman to the living network and ultimately connect them all back to Ultros? This challenge is as time-consuming as it sounds. For context, it took me about 9.5 hours to reach 2 of the game's endings. But completing the true ending by connecting everything to the living network, according to howlongtobeat.com, that would bump playtime to a whopping 15 plus hours. So that brings up a couple of questions. One, Luke, why didn't you get the true ending? There are a few reasons. One, it takes so long to do it. And two, it requires a part of the brain I don't really like to exercise too much while I'm playing video games. And what I mean by that is, if I'm going to connect everything to the living network, that's going to require an extensive amount of planning and foresight. That means you'll need to restart loops multiple times to get the seeds you need, plant them in the right spots, feed creatures so they can create gardens for you, and wait for plants to mature. It's an intricate puzzle that demands patience and perseverance, and quite frankly, those are not my strong suits. But I'll say this, even though I didn't engage with the living network in its entirety to get the true ending, I respect the hell out of it. It is so cool. The living network is such a unique and creative idea, and it's executed incredibly well, though I did not like how fast travel was linked to it. But the living network goes beyond just its novelty. Its introduction completely changes how you approach the game. The hack and slash exploration heavy gameplay you've gotten used to gives way to one of the most inventive puzzle platformers I've played in a long time. Such a gameplay switch up would typically murder a game's pacing, but because the living network is optional, I think it works in Ultros' favor. Another amazing aspect of the living network arc is how it connects to the game's themes. Okay, before I dive into the narrative's themes and connect them to the living network, pun definitely intended, I want to say Ultros did a great job and is much smarter than I initially gave it credit for. Let's start with the first theme of creation versus destruction, or life and rebirth. That's simple enough with the whole time loop and gardening mechanic where plants epitomize the life and rebirth cycle. And if we view this cycle figuratively, we can see it in how Ouija evolves from a shaman suppressing Ultros to someone connecting Ultros and the living network to liberate him. So, what the heck does that mean, connecting Ultros to the living network, and what does it imply? First, we gotta figure out what Ultros is. This game has a ton of lore, but I'm not gonna go over it extensively because I'm not a lore channel, but I am a narrative guy with an analytical brain, so I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of the lore before looking at things symbolically. Ultros, initially referred to as the Entity, is a sentient energy source that crash-landed on the planet Baria. The Barian shamans, or Shamazel, discovered they could transfer their dark and negative thoughts into the Entity, freeing themselves from the mental and physical burdens of their rituals. This led to a golden age of prosperity and harmony for the Barians, during which the Entity was enshrined in a temple. As the Barians evolved and spread across the stars, the temple was converted into a massive spaceship called the Sarcophagus. The ship became a haven for individuals seeking to live free from darkness, with the Entity continuing to absorb negative energy. However, as the Entity was fed an ever-growing amount of dark thoughts, it became corrupted, exerting a demonic influence over the ship. This led to the creation of monstrous creatures, the death or transformation of many inhabitants, and the decline of Barian civilization aboard the sarcophagus. In a desperate effort to contain Ultros' corruption, the remaining shamans sealed themselves in pods to maintain the entity's containment and created a time loop failsafe. The player, seemingly the 8th shaman, must unravel the mystery of the sarcophagus, manage the failsafe, and ultimately prevent Ultros from fully awakening, risking the destruction of consciousness itself. Alright, that's a lot to unpack, so let's break it down even more. In essence, the sarcophagus was a luxury cruise liner housing a demon that was fed nothing but darkness. And now that demon is ready to awaken and wreck shit. If we just focus on Ultros and all his symbolic significance, it makes the use of the living network so much more impactful. Ultros represents a lot of things. The weight of repressing negative thoughts and the emotional burden that has on our mental health, hubris and the exploitation of power, religious and existential duality, the double-edged nature of power and trying to maintain a balance between creation and corruption. Take your pick. Any way you slice it, Ultros personifies the old saying, your chickens have come home to roost. Okay, to truly understand the significance of both Ultros' threat and the living network's role, we gotta get Jungian up in here and talk about the collective unconscious. I'm by no means an expert on psychoanalysis, but I did listen to Tool growing up, so I'd say I'm more than qualified. And I'd be surprised if you're not already familiar with the collective unconscious, especially if you watched Akira like I did as a kid. See? My credentials keep stacking up. To be brief, the collective unconscious is a shared repository of thoughts, fears, and emotions that unites all sentient beings. For this, Carl Jung, a very famous psychologist, maybe you've heard of him, constructed the idea of archetypes, basically universal themes, motifs, and symbols that evoke emotional responses across all of humanity. One of these archetypes significant to Ultros is the shadow. The aspects of the self that are repressed or denied but cannot be destroyed. The Baryons and Shamans' attempts to banish their darkness leads to that darkness's externalization in a demonic form. This is why I love the idea of the living network. And one of the game's pacifist boss victories I accidentally stumbled into. Yes, you can beat every boss in this game without hacking them to death, and it's awesome, clever, and fits right in with the True Endings theme. Anyway, you must connect 3 sisters to the living network. This connection explicitly showcases Jung's idea of the collective unconscious by taking inspiration from real-life mycelium networks found in fungi, essentially showing that this world has a collective consciousness that's been severed by what I presume is all the nasty things I brought up earlier. Hubris, self-interest, emotional repression, and, more tangibly, the gluttonous pursuit of happiness over purpose, as seen by the sisters who gave up their connection to the living network, either willingly or unwillingly, for their desire to live eternally. And so, what is the living network? As you've probably pieced together yourself, it represents humanity restoring its connection with nature and other humans, or aliens in this case, by accepting both the light and dark sides of our being. Repressing our darkness instead of facing it head on requires that we wear masks, and these masks, or false selves, make it impossible to have real human connections. Y'all ever watch Neon Genesis Evangelion? This is exactly what Shinji or someone else complains about at some point, almost verbatim if I recall correctly. Anyway, Ouija's epic world tour of connecting everyone back to the living network and Ultros forces everyone to face their darkness so they can find their way back to the light. And when everyone has overcome and accepted their own shadows, it turns the big bad shadow that is the demon Ultros to the light. Because saving the monster saves everyone, am I right? It's an old trope, but I love it. And this trope brings us to the final symbol Ultros embodies, the cycle of trauma and redemption. Ultros, the game, is actually quite beautiful, despite what its garish colors would have you think.
Final thoughts and score.
Ultros is an unconventional and deeply unique experience that's far more clever than anyone gives it credit for. While it doesn't adhere to traditional Metroidvania norms, it carves out its own identity through innovative mechanics, psychedelic visuals, and an engaging narrative. Combat's straightforward yet rewarding if you embrace the perfect variety system. The gardening and environmental manipulation mechanics redefine what exploration in a Metroidvania can be, and while the time loop motif initially sounds daunting, the game's thoughtful design ensures it becomes a feature, not a flaw. However, Ultros isn't for everyone. Its dizzying visuals and lack of traditional progression rewards may alienate some players. But for those who embrace its creativity and out-of-the-box approach, Ultros offers an unforgettable journey. I award Ultros an 8 out of 10. Ultros is currently on PC and PlayStation 4 and 5. I completed Ultros in 9.5 hours for 2 of its endings and didn't mess with its true ending because it wasn't something I wanted to do, but I still respect it a lot. I played the game entirely on the Steam Deck with 0 issues and thus award the game a Steam Deck rating of verified.
Pair placement.
Ultros feels like an evolution of the Metroidvania genre, for better or for worse. I've never played anything like it. It twists nearly every tenet of the genre into something unexpected, blending roguelike-esque time loops with a highly creative gardening mechanic. While its exploration feels unrewarding due to the small amount of discoverable items and secrets, the plant-based traversal system is so fresh and innovative that it's hard not to admire. Combat, though intuitive and easy to grasp, lacks depth and challenge. However, It's clear this is an intentional design choice, emphasizing exploration and creativity over difficulty. Late game gardening mechanics add layers of complexity, but can also feel tedious, especially when trying to get the game's true ending. Ultros is undeniably clever, with a clear artistic vision that fully commits to its ideas, pushing the envelope of the genre in ways both admirable and divisive. And it's this pushing of the envelope that truly gives Ultros its identity, far more than its bold visual style. That said, Ultros may struggle to satisfy hardcore Metroidvania fans due to its deviations from genre conventions. Its lack of rewarding backtracking, direct power-ups, and intricate map progression means it won't scratch the same itch as more traditional titles. Ultros plants itself in the B tier. Ultros is a fascinating experiment that deserves credit for taking bold risks, but its departure from core genre conventions might not appeal to Metroidvania purists. It's a solid game for those seeking a fresh twist, but it doesn't quite reach the upper echelons of the genre. For hardcore Metroidvaniers with an open mind looking for something different, I say give the game a shot. Ultros may not be the ultimate Metroidvania, but it sure plants the seeds of something uniquely unforgettable.